Hi guys, it's Rory here. Just wanted to leave a quick note to say that if you enjoyed last week's episode and want to keep up to date with the content that we release every week, please remember to follow or subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or whichever platform you're listening to us on. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify specifically, please also remember to leave us a review. It means a lot to us and does wonders for pushing our podcast in front of new listeners every week. Once you've done that, leave a comment on Spotify or come and join us on X, BlueSky, or Instagram and let us know that you've left a review. It means a whole lot to us and we'll make sure that we get in touch with you to say thank you. Thank you once again for listening. Enjoy the show. Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage Podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and today I'm joined by Joey Dorso.
Hi, good to speak to you. Looking forward to it.
It's great to have you on, Joey. Thank you very much for joining us today, straight out of a shift at work, which is massively appreciated. Joey is a published author, a football writer, and a senior data journalist with The Times. Previously, he was also an investigative reporter for The Athletic, and his book, which was published this year, is called More Than a Shirt, How Football Shirts Explain Global Politics, Money and Power. Really kind of focuses on this intersection between cultural expression, marketing and geopolitical power. And that's exactly what the feature of this episode is going to be today. Obviously, by that title, our long-time listeners will know that this is something that's right up my street. So I'm really excited to actually speak with Joey today and pick his brains on some of the things that he found out while he was writing this book, but also researching it and doing the investigation for it. Just before we kick things off properly, Joey, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, so I work at the moment for the Times and Sunday Times. I've been doing it for about 2 years. My career is basically flitting between political journalism, or I guess kind of mainstream journalism about the things you see in the news, and sport.
Nice.
And football journalism. And so this is sort of where the two meet. The two things I'm obsessed with, which are football and politics and current affairs. And yeah, there's quite a lot of overlap there these days, and it's increasingly difficult to be a football fan. I had it for the first time recently. I'm a big Aston Villa fan, and I'd never really had to think about politics at all supporting Villa, thankfully, unlike a Newcastle fan or a Man City fan where it's completely unavoidable. But then all this Maccabee thing kicked off the other day, and I hated it. I just sort of buried my head in the sand. I didn't want to talk about it because it sort of penetrated that kind of slightly sacred space for me where I don't think about politics. So yeah, it's increasingly hard to avoid and untangle the two these days. But, it's not all depressing. There are some stories, I think, which are pretty uplifting and interesting. I love it and I find it just fascinating.
Yeah, massively so. Like you said there's a huge, when we look at the Venn diagram between politics, football, marketing, power and all these types of things, there's quite a nice little niche in there, I think. There's a nice centre point where all those things collide and it leads to some really interesting discussions. But I was just actually thinking there when you said, if I think about a lot of the football books that have actually been published these days, there's not a lot that aren't actually, politically centric. They're all kind of focusing on a lot of things. Sports washing is obviously huge at the moment, and especially given that it's not just football that currently seems to be being bought all over the world, also golf, F1. I think we're going to be seeing quite a lot more of publications that are actually focusing on the relationship between these things coming out. And like you said, it's getting increasingly more difficult to actually escape these themes in everyday football.
Yeah, completely. I mean, as you said, golf, tennis, every sport is getting disrupted by political power, particularly from the Middle East. So you might want to bury your head in the sand and avoid it, but it's not really possible anymore.
It's certainly not going away. And this idea of power is something that's crept up quite a lot on our podcast over the course of this year. I suppose probably more so when we spoke with Ronnie Blaschke. He released a book a couple of years ago called Power Players, which focused on this sort of idea of football and its relationship with power, whether it be power through politics and government, fan power, or power within wars such as in Yugoslavia and the Yugoslavian ultras. So we've been discussing it, and it's been a bit of a kind of common thread through a number of our other episodes. But when we talk about football kits, we then get into ideas of sponsorship, marketing, and that's a completely different area of power that we haven't really touched on yet. So within the research for this book that you've done, Joey, what do we mean when we say power?
Yeah, well, big question. I mean, I suppose the most obvious one in football is the power of nation states. And you see that with, I've already mentioned a few times, Abu Dhabi and Man City, Saudi Arabia and Newcastle. But there are some more subtle ones, like I look at Gazprom, which sponsored the Champions League for a long time and sponsored Schalke in Germany. That's, Russian state power exercised through football. You've got Visit Rwanda on the sleeves of Arsenal. And more, football is just the biggest cultural thing in the world by such a long way. Nothing comes close to it. You think about, because it transcends language, right, which film doesn't, music doesn't. And so more and more powerful people, be that companies, be that rich individuals, be that countries, want to get involved.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it does speak to the kind of cultural power of football at this moment in time. I think especially from an English context, in terms of how the Premier League is at the moment, it's, I mean, probably one of the most multicultural leagues in the world. I mean, it is by and large, and the power and the money centred in that really kind of goes beyond what our comprehension of numbers are, and really kind of skews what our perception of money and numbers actually is, just because of the sheer amount that's actually involved in it. Obviously, you spoke about all this and more in your recent book, which focused on the relationship between football shirts and global politics, money and power. I'm guessing that the idea of this book came from your work with an investigative reporting, or was it something that you had always kind of had in mind to do? Is it kind of like a specific interest within your side of work?
Yeah, so when I was at The Athletic as an investigative reporter, I did sort of two big investigations, or two big strands of investigations, one of which was about gambling companies, and particularly Football Index, this company which dramatically imploded and took loads of people's money with it. And the other one was cryptocurrency, and some really shady sponsors sponsoring top Premier League clubs that I figured out traced back to some pretty shady stuff in East Asia. Sure was linked to some organised crime. And so that got me really interested in football sponsorship. And I've always been a massive, football fan. But I mean, it was really in COVID when I was watching on TV and there was no fans in the stadiums, and my eyes were sort of darting around all these strange sponsors, and I was looking them up on my phone. So that's, I guess, the sort of my genesis of my interest in football sponsorship. And then it became this kind of much bigger thing, and I went all over the world to find out more about it, to investigate, to do the reporting for this book.
It's fantastic. The cryptocurrency one was really weird. There was a kind of big case of it in Scotland with Rangers and Hibs, who were both sponsored by Sportimon Go, who
I remember that, yeah.
just didn't really seem to exist at all.
Absolute nonsense, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But somehow they found a way onto the jerseys of two of the biggest clubs in the country, so it's absolutely wild. But I think when you then start to actually dig deep into it, you realise that there's a whole bunch of reasons why. Sometimes it does just come down to people at clubs being a bit daft and not doing their due diligence, but there's a lot of other reasons behind why those sponsorships end up on there as well. But kind of more generally speaking, how is it that football kits actually kind of fit into this relationship between global power and marketing powerhouses and geopolitics?
Yeah, well, I think it's massive. And I think, I've been all over the world researching this book, from Colombia to India to Qatar, South Africa, America, all over Europe. And you just see football shirts everywhere. And I don't think that was true like 10, 15 years ago. It was true in some parts of the world, but now it's everywhere. And I think a big reason for that is mobile internet has kind of, it used to be that you needed satellite TV to watch football, right? Whereas now there's people in rural India watching football streamed on their phones for a very small sum of money, who might not even have like proper sanitation facilities in their house, right? It's so universal, this watching football. I think that's a really sudden and dramatic thing, that football is just so global and so much more than any other sport, so much more than any other cultural movement or trend. So that makes it wrapped up in these big questions of politics and power.
And with it becoming global brings obviously new markets and new opportunities as well, I think, importantly.
Yeah, new markets, absolutely. I mean, just all over the world. I was actually in Pakistan recently, which is about as far from a football country as you can imagine. It's got the fifth biggest population in the world, and it's 198th in the FIFA rankings. But even there, you see football shirts everywhere. You see kids playing football everywhere. And I'm not saying they're going to be troubling the World Cup knockout stages anytime soon, but even in the place that's the least football in the world, pretty much, football is everywhere.
Yeah, really interesting. It's great to hear, obviously, from your first-hand experience, how different football cultures actually immerse themselves in it. But like you said, it's the marketing side of things, and with that brings power and opportunities for power. I mean, one of the big things for me recently is at the highest levels of the game, especially, and you've already touched on it, like football kits are becoming like increasingly more politicised every single year. And the more football clubs get bought by whichever regime or whichever businessman from whichever country, that's just going to keep continuing.
Yeah, I mean, one example that I mentioned in the book is if you think about that Arsenal against Real Madrid game in the Champions League, when Declan Rice scored those 2 free kicks in the space of about 10 minutes. That was Emirates versus Emirates at the Emirates.
I've never thought of it like that, yeah. It's a fair point.
Yeah, and so Emirates is the Dubai state airline. I mean, some of your listeners might have flown with it to, if you're going to anywhere, it's a massive airline in the UK and beyond. But it's basically, it's the state power of the Emirate of Dubai. And by sponsoring football shirts, it gets its name everywhere. And it's about much more than advertising an airline. It's about getting the branding of this airline that is very closely linked to the state of Dubai and the leaders of Dubai all over the world.
It's the same as the Newcastle kit, which was the colours of the Saudi flag. Tried to come up with some really kind of thinly veiled reason for bringing the kit out, but it's all kind of linked back to these different things, and again, sports washing is a massive thing, but it's just becoming so much more blatant, I think. And even if we boil it down to other examples, Rangers also recently released a kit within the last week, actually, which was a throwback to their Scottish Cup treble win in 2003, 2004, whenever it was. But it's a completely orange kit. That is not the reason for the kit, but if you publicly say why the reason for that kit is, then you're going to get so much backlash from higher levels of like the government and things like that. For me, that's kind of what's interesting, is how football clubs tap into this heritage with their fans and almost kind of gain favour from it, because they're ducking and dodging the real reasons for bringing the kits out. And it's for their fans, and I appreciate that, but it's just interesting how they use their power in that way as well, I guess.
Yeah, I write about the orange kits of Rangers in the book. I don't need to tell you, but the orange associated with Protestantism, and the Orange Order in Scotland and Ireland. I believe that first happened when Rangers had lots of Dutch players, and was it Dick Advocaat was the manager?
Yeah, that's right.
And they said it was, for the same reason, because of Protestantism and King William of Orange. Orange is the national colour of the Netherlands, and it was said that was why. But I think, reading between the lines, I think there was something else going on there.
100%. Again, it's interesting, and obviously I'm a Celtic fan, and I always find it quite funny when I see these things, but we'll get on to the Rangers example later, because I know that was one that you touched on in the book. So let's jump on to some of the examples I actually wrote about. You mentioned one already, which was Putin's wars, and obviously Gazprom, one of the biggest sponsors of a number of clubs throughout Europe prior to the war in Ukraine, notably Schalke 04, and also Red Star Belgrade in Serbia. And this is probably one of the most blatant examples and one of the best case studies we can probably touch on for football kits and the relationship with power, I think.
Yeah, and I went there. I went to Gelsenkirchen. I watched a game and spoke to lots of Schalke fans and people who used to work for the club and all sorts. And so the story goes back to 2007. And Schalke, suddenly a picture emerged of Vladimir Putin, quite a bit younger then, and Clement Tönnies, who was the owner of Schalke, a meat processing tycoon. And the two of them were in a boardroom somewhere holding aloft a Schalke shirt with the Gazprom logo on it. Pretty baffling to everyone why this would happen, because Schalke's nowhere near the sort of eastern borders of Germany. It's in the far west. It's a very sort of working class club built on the coal fields of the Ruhr. So it kind of came out of nowhere. And basically, over time, Schalke executives were schmoozing with German politicians in the box there and with Gazprom executives. And it was a tool of Russian soft power, because Russia was selling cheap gas to Germany over a long period of time. German consumers and companies were kind of hooked on Russian gas. And there was this kind of almost slightly unpleasant, looking back on it, closeness between the two. And it all came crumbling down, of course, in February 2022, when Putin invaded Ukraine, and Schalke kind of hurried to wipe that Gazprom logo off their shirts. I saw fans wearing those blue shirts, but with the logo covered up with a blue sticker. I think fans groups gave them out after the invasion. But yeah, it's a very sort of, I guess, I find it quite a compelling example of how a football shirt that is very familiar to a lot of us, not just because of Schalke, but because of the UEFA Champions League, which had Gazprom branding all over it for a long time, is now deeply associated with Vladimir Putin and his war of aggression in Ukraine.
Yeah, it was quite interesting, the aftermath of that as well. And again, you can link the example of Gazprom to different football clubs, the nations that they play in, and their nation's relationship with Putin's Russia, because of course in Serbia, where Gazprom also sponsors not just Red Star Belgrade, but a couple of other clubs at the time, I think, they wore it with pride almost. And then you had this kind of weird example of some people who were critical of the opposition to Russia and Putin, who would wear shirts with the Gazprom sponsor on it to kind of show that and express it.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. In Serbia?
No, well, just all over the world. There were some cases in America. There were some people who were taking photos of that and flaunting it.
Really? Gazprom logo as well?
A couple of people in Scotland as well. They're associated with certain political groups, you understand. So it kind of ties back to their sort of political identity as opposed to their footballing identity, but they would wear Gazprom shirts as a way to express that.
I didn't know that was going on in Scotland, but certainly in Serbia, Red Star are still sponsored by Gazprom. And Serbia have a very different relationship with Russia to most of Europe. They're very close to Russia. They see the Gazprom money as a big reason why they've competed in the Champions League recently. I think they beat Liverpool the other year. They drew with AC Milan. So they're on the fringes of it, but they're there. And a large reason for that is the 10 million a year they get from Gazprom.
Huge amount of money wrapped up in that sponsorship deal as well. It's absolutely crazy, but again, it's interesting seeing the comparisons, especially within the fans, and how how the fans at Schalke dealt with it, and obviously how the fans at Red Star Belgrade deal with it as well. Of course, when there's alignments like that, then it's almost kind of expected that that's going to happen. But again, it just comes back to this idea of the intersection between politics and marketing, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And, this idea of it being kind of unavoidable. The Schalke fans didn't
Mm.
ask for it. But when you've got Putin invading Ukraine and the Gazprom being a large part of that, and that's the company on your team shirts, I mean, you can't really avoid it.
No, there's nothing that you can really do to escape it. And if I remember correctly, Schalke were quite quick to get rid of that particular sponsorship. I don't think it happened almost overnight.
Oh, it was within a few days. Yeah, I mean, I think there was a
Yeah.
big backlash. I mean, German football fans are very sort of political, much more so than in the UK, in England, or in Scotland. I mean, I think the reason why it wasn't a big deal before was because Germany is generally more receptive to Russia than maybe other European countries, and was certainly buying this gas at a good price, and it was an awkward topic for them. But yeah, as soon as that happened, it was over pretty quickly, and that really negatively affected Schalke. Schalke were relegated. I wouldn't say it was completely because of that, but it was a huge hole in their accounts. But yeah, some things kind of crossed the line, and that did.
Massively so. One particular example that you mentioned earlier, and one that I've got an interest in myself, is the idea. I think the chapter in the book was called The Global Gamble. And of course, it's all about gambling sponsors and football, of which there are a huge number, but increasingly more so I'd say probably in the last decade, there's been a huge number of betting companies and online gambling companies, particularly, who have ended up on sponsorships, on advertising boards who no one has really heard of. And at first, I think people just kind of put it down to, well, they're from another country, so why would we have heard of those? But it started to become a bit more of an issue, and I think people then soon realised that a lot of these companies are actually either shell companies linked to organised crime, like you mentioned earlier, or just outright don't exist.
Yeah, and the thing is here is it's about advertising to people in China, which is a
Mm.
country of 1.3 billion people, a lot of whom like football. But gambling is it's pretty simply illegal in China. There are no gambling firms, there's no bookies on the high street, but there is the internet. And so the way that gambling firms reach people in China is online, usually companies based in the Philippines or Vietnam, where there are whole cities or towns full of Chinese workers working on this stuff. And they advertise to people through the Premier League, through an Everton shirt or through a Burnley shirt. And yeah, some of these companies were, the writing was all in Mandarin Chinese, but gambling firms are illegal in China. So it's a pretty curious state of affairs. And yeah, as you said, it's pretty clear now that some of these companies were linked to some very shady stuff, potentially organised crime.
Absolutely. I think there was a pretty high profile case with Everton, especially in a gambling company, Wolves as well. I mean, there's been a whole number in the last few years, but as well as organised crime, I mean, a lot of these companies are linked with some incredibly shady and dodgy stuff. Again, it comes back to marketing exposure and also money. But if some of that money's dirty, then again, I mean, a lot of the money in football is dirty. It's just a kind of fact of the game in this day and age. But the gambling thing, I think, is something that not a lot of people would expect at first when they see it. Again, coming back to Celtic are sponsored by Dafabet. They have been for, I don't know, maybe coming up to 10, 11 years now. I've never used Dafabet. I don't really know anyone who does use Dafabet.
It's Asian. It's East Asian Dafabet, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, it's not really about Scotland or Celtic. Yeah,
No, it's just all kind of comes out of the blue. And I guess when you mentioned that there, when you talk about sponsors that aren't really related to the club, I mean, previously it was Magners, which, Magners Irish Cider, fair enough.
yeah. Carling, I remember.
Carling as well, Tenants,
NTL.
NTL,
Yeah,
it's a good one.
they used to
People's
always share
as
with
well.
Rangers, didn't they?
Yeah, NTL and Carlin for a bit as well. Tenants was another one as well, and then
Yeah,
obviously Rangers when they were coming back up the divisions were Blackthorn Cider. So
yeah.
been quite a number, but I mean when you then take that locality away, it kind of changes a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it must have been the rationale that if you're NTL, you don't want half of Glasgow to cancel their electricity bill, so you're better off going with both.
It's quite clever. And for a while, Rangers was sponsored by McEwen's Export because it was like a misconception, particularly in the west of Scotland, that if you drank McEwen's, which is a kind of heavy export beer, then you were a Protestant, whereas if you drank a certain type of other beer or cider, then you were Catholic. It's just like, again, conceptions and these weird little things that kind of come up, but then when we come on to talk about like betting companies, for a while Rangers were 32 Red, I think now they're largely Unibet. It takes away that locality and that link to a lot of fans, which can impact their connection with the club, their heritage with the club, and their overall identity with how they actually feel to the club as well. But I mean, some of the stories that come out, especially in the Premier League with gambling companies, are just absolutely insane.
Yeah, you're right. And there's certainly been a big shift away from companies with local roots. I mean, you go back to sort of the 80s and you get really kind of the local car dealership or local brewery or tool manufacturer or something pretty kind of low rent would be often sponsoring the clubs, and then it becomes much more international. In the Premier League, you get lots of Japanese electronics companies come along in the 90s. Brother at Man City, Sharp at Manchester United, JVC at Arsenal. loads of them, Liverpool and Hitachi. That was kind of about selling electronic goods to Brits, to, a Manchester United fan living in Manchester or wherever else. It wasn't really a global thing. And then in the 2000s, you get, Manchester United, probably because it's the most familiar shirt to the most people, is quite a good case study. Like, Vodafone was still a pretty sort of domestic one, but then you get later on and you get like Chevrolet and AIA, AIG and these big multinational companies. So it all becomes much more international in the last kind of 15 years. Well, that's in England, less so in Scotland.
Yeah, the thing that's kind of popped into my head there, Joey, it's obviously with how big the retro kit market has become nowadays, a lot of people put a lot of value in the sponsors. So example that comes to my mind is Fiorentina, the Nintendo shirts.
Yeah, God, right? I got a dodgy one of them and it melted in the wash. The sponsor just all melted, all stuck together. I think it cost me like 30 quid, where the proper ones are supposed to cost 150. So I learnt my lesson.
That was rotten. Buy cheap, buy twice, I suppose. But when you're buying them that cheap, then it's so you can go out in them and not feel bad about it because it was like 150 quid or more.
Yeah. You see people wearing those things at five-a-side football or whatever, and like,
how are you sweating in this?
Yeah,
it's incredible. But I mean, I was just kind of thinking there, like in, I don't know, 20, 30, 50 years time, however long we look back at some of the kits that come out today, like how much are these shirts going to be devalued because the sponsors are global companies, or devalued or viewed differently because they're companies that maybe don't exist or never existed or were just there to kind of front money?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I don't know if that will really make a big difference. I mean, yeah, I'm a Villa fan, and one of the big Villa shirts, it was the Mita Copiers, MITA, which is like a Japanese photocopy company that I don't think exists anymore. Certainly doesn't sell to people in the UK. I'm not sure anyone cares too much about that. I mean, the best one, of course, is Muller Yoggers in the sort of mid-90s glory years. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. Brutally honest, I mean, I wish people cared more because it'd give me more work, but I don't think people care that much. If the sponsors are, money laundering front or whatever, I don't think people are that bothered.
Entirely fair. Yeah, no, it was just something that crossed my mind there when we come to be looking back in these companies, but it's an interesting thought. I don't know if many people will be clamouring over Celtic's Daffy shirts, but you never know. I mean, speaking of Scottish examples, one of the ones that you mentioned as well was Borders, which is a really interesting one. Borders, national identities and cultural identities are something that we talk an awful lot about on this podcast, so this chapter was particularly important for me to cover, and Rangers were one of the clubs mentioned in it as well. I think for some of the reasons that you touched on earlier on when we spoke about them.
Yeah, so that looks at two very contentious borders, the one in Israel-Palestine and also in Northern Ireland, and how football and identity is used to talk about those borders. So in Northern Ireland and Ireland and Scotland, you of course have Celtic in their Irish green, built by people, I mean, you'll know this history better than me, but Catholics who came over from Ireland to Scotland in the potato famine, right? And set up the boys' club. And deeply rooted in that Irish community of Glasgow. Rangers from the Govan dockyards, Northern Irish Protestants, and then again, deeply rooted in that Glasgow's Protestant community. The Israel-Palestine shirt, or the Palestine shirt, I should say. I've spoken about this one a few times, and shown people it, and it's a green and white striped shirt with a clover on it, a bit like Celtic, and it has sort of Arabic writing on it, but it's not from Scotland, it's not from the Middle East, it's actually from Chile, Club Deportivo Palestino. So the biggest Palestinian community in the world is in Chile. A load of Arab Christians moved over there 100, 150 years ago and set up this big community, and they, as you can imagine, feel very strongly about the Palestinian cause, about what's been going on in the last couple of years. And so they have this sort of friendship with the Green Brigades, this Celtic supporters group that have spoken up a lot about Palestine. And so they wear this green and white shirt. So yeah, that sort of tells you how, one shirt worn in Chile tells you about a border in the Middle East, and one shirt in Scotland tells you about a border, on the other side of the Irish Sea.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. Chile has other examples as well. O'Higgins, one of my favourite examples from Chile.
Irish, yeah.
Who are named after this Irish general who fought in the wars against the conquistadors and all this. So it's wholly fascinating how you can look at different football teams, football kits and their histories, and actually glean for it that they were born from different geopolitical issues that were happening elsewhere in the world.
Newell's Old Boys in Argentina, Messi's first club. I haven't looked into it, but there must be a British connection there. Newell's, yeah.
100%. Another good one in Argentina is there's a few clubs called Almirante Brown, named after Admiral William Brown, who was born in County Mayo in Ireland. So again, like loads of examples, particularly in South America. But obviously the Rangers one's interesting to me for a number of reasons. Of course, my dad's family are all Rangers supporters, and a lot of my dad's family, not him, but a lot of his family are quite heavily involved with what they would call their orange roots, their orange identity. And they express it quite proudly, quite wholly. Two of them live in Australia. They set up Orange Lodges over there, but they always tie it back to Rangers as opposed to being anything overly cultural. It's interesting how they've then taken that to another part of the world to go and spread it. Obviously, Australia has a huge Scottish and Irish diaspora anyway, but because of the nature of geopolitics and the movement of people between Ireland and Scotland, obviously it's kind of went from being an Irish thing to an Irish Scots thing to a Protestant Scots thing, and now people are spreading it all over the world. So again, the borders side of things is moving with the people and the culture that they take with them.
Yeah, I followed it. I don't know if it's Instagram or TikTok, but I've seen an account for this Rangers bar in Benidorm, and there's like they're singing all these songs and everything's orange, and it's pretty crazy. They get everywhere.
Yeah, it's mad. It's funny though. It's interesting to see, and obviously talking about it from a heritage and culture perspective is always quite interesting. But I mean, obviously that's kind of the highest echelons of the game we're talking about there, and as I've mentioned a few times, there's a huge amount of money and power and exposure tied up with that. But you always, and I mean, throughout history, you've always had shirts from smaller clubs with a little less power and political pull, but maybe the most power or political pull within their associations releasing similar shirts. And I think one of the big examples for me that's come out within the last few years has been Bohemians or Bows in Ireland, who seem to release a new kit like every 6 weeks or something like that. Their reasons for doing so are obviously tied to their identity and what the identity they're trying to create, but it's also helped save the club and pull them out of what was near annihilation, which is also quite interesting. But they seem to be aligning it with a lot of different cultural movements now that aren't necessarily political. And it's certainly handing them a lot of power and exposure all over the world.
Yeah, and I think various celebrities have worn it. It's a real sort of hipster. You see a lot of it in like East London, people wearing Bose shirts, which I'm sure you wouldn't have done 5 years ago. But yeah, fair play to them. I mean, it's definitely making them a lot of money, and there's not a lot of money flowing around Irish football. So, I mean, although it's kind of thriving, it's a really fascinating story at the moment. I went there a couple of years ago, and just it's booming. And they play at the is it the Aviva, the big stadium now? Like they play a game there, which they didn't used to, and attendances are massively up since the pandemic. So it's a pretty exciting place at the moment in football terms.
Yeah, I was overseeing a Shell's Linfield game in July. I think that was the Champions League first round qualifier, and it was rocking. Like, it was brilliant. The atmosphere was fantastic, and Shell's at Toka Park even have a stand closed, so it didn't really impact anything. But really interesting league. And kind of similarly, Clapton CFC in London, who are a community-run club, released their International Brigade jersey. And again, it brought them a lot of attention for being a relatively small football team. But again, they're tapping into local politics and heritage to promote that. But I think it would be fair to say it's always done with the aim of getting their name out there a little bit more.
Yeah, I've never actually, I don't live too far from there, but I've never been. But yeah, they're very effective at sort of, you get these sort of inner London clubs or not inner London, but non-league in London. There's not a lot of non-league in a massive city because land is so scarce. So yeah, they get a lot of attention, and yeah, fair play to them. Did they have the sort of rainbow kit at one point, Clapton? I've seen people wearing that. I'm not sure.
I think so. I'm not too sure. The International Brigade one was purple, yellow, and red. I suppose kind of similar,
Spanish
but
Civil War, yeah.
Yeah, so that was another really interesting one, but the probably most recent one, which certainly is a high level of power and influence involved, was the Reform UK football kits that were brought out.
Farage 10, number 10.
I mean, he obviously knows exactly what he's doing by doing that. He's appealing to largely what he sees as his demographic. And a lot of people might say that demographic are turkeys voting for Christmas, but I mean, at the end of the day, he's doing what a lot of politicians have failed to do. But again, it's this politicisation of football that he's really tapping into. And again, not seen much of it up in Scotland, but I've got friends down in England who've certainly seen a lot of people wearing those jerseys. And
really?
I mean, I mean, I thought it was going to be just a kind of like tacky piece of merchandise that was never really going to take off. But I mean, I've had friends say that within their communities, they have seen people out and about wearing them. So.
Oh. I've never seen it, but maybe I live in a bubble. I mean, they're making a lot of money from it. It's funny, Farage in football. He, I think one of his kids is a Crystal Palace fan or something, or he claims to be a Crystal Palace fan. And Crystal Palace obviously have this quite sort of left wing thing going on, so I don't think some of their ultras were very happy about that. But that is who he identifies with on a club level.
It's interesting, but again, like that's obviously a very blatant use of power and a very blatant way to try and gain power, which has obviously worked. And again, he knows exactly what he's doing by doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'd take it too seriously, really. I just want a bit of attention, make a bit of money. But I suppose, what is interesting is the sort of, you've really seen in the last year or two, more of a kind of pro-reform element in football fans and sort of away fan culture, which is normally pretty apolitical in the UK. certainly compared to continental Europe. And always has been, really. Like, even in the sort of dark days of the 80s and the hooliganism, I mean, you get horrible racism, but it was very rarely kind of organised like far right groups or far left groups like you get in Italy or elsewhere. English football and Scottish football have never really had a big, I suppose Celtic are maybe identified with the left, but it's never really been organised in that way it has in Europe. And maybe a bit of that has been changing in the last year or two, but I think most people go to football to get away from all of that, but not everyone.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with you. It's much less political over here than it is elsewhere in continental Europe, and yeah, it's interesting looking at all these different examples of football kits, different examples of power and marketing power and money from across different levels of the game. But some points to take away, I guess, especially if, from where your book is concerned, where there's a huge amount of power and money involved in that. Is it all through the sponsors, or can it also be down to the design of the football kits? Because there's a lot that you can convey to people and ask of people within the design of football kits. It's almost like a dialogue in its own right.
Yeah, and not all the examples I use are about sponsors. I mean, I think particularly national kits represent all sorts of things to all sorts of people. The example I use is the French national kit and the blue. We all know that shirt, the blue of France, but that has meant very different things over time. I mean, France was a bit of a sort of second-rate footballing country until they obviously won the European Championship in the 80s with Platini, but until the 1998 World Cup, when of course they won it on home soil. And Zinedine Zidane was their star player, the child of immigrants from Algeria. And it was this sort of story of, happy France and its multicultural identity. And they won the Euros in 2000. But a few years later, when they did terribly at various World Cups, I mean, in 2002, they lost to Senegal, famously, the opening game. And it kind of went the other way. It was like lots of French, sort of particularly on the right of French politics, were saying, oh, this multicultural team, and, they're useless, and they're not singing the national anthem and this sort of thing. And then, of course, France won the World Cup in 2018 with Kylian Mbappe, who's another child of immigrants from France's former colonies in Africa. So if you look through which I tell the book of the story of French football and immigration and politics, it's this kind of the meaning of the national shirt shifts a lot over time, basically depending on how well the team are doing.
Yeah, that's very true. Of course, France, another really interesting example, especially with how they've used football in things like nation building in their former colonies in Africa, particularly in places like Morocco and things like that. And of course, importantly, it's not always negatives that we can attach to these. Obviously, we're talking about some pretty high-profile regimes and examples here, but they can also be used for positive means. They can be used for community causes, and they can be used for things that can actually be a bit of a force for good within the football community.
Yeah, an example I use is South Africa, and I went there. I went to Robben Island, which is where Mandela was held in solitary confinement for all those years. And football there tells a really positive story about how the anti-apartheid movement, so the black people protesting against the very racist regime in South Africa, there were lots of different sort of disparate groups. There were communists, there was the African National Congress, various other groups, and they didn't always get along with each other, which sort of harmed the fight against apartheid. Their opponents were quite divided, but through football they actually it brought down some of the boundaries against apartheid, and they played in this mini league on Robben Island, and gradually over time they started off being organised by sort of faction, and then those boundaries kind of dissolved over time, and you'd have sort of transfers and whatever else, and people started talking to each other more. And Mandela himself has said it was actually a really important moment in the fight against apartheid because it really united the opposition, and they gathered around their shared goals, and it meant that some pretty amazing things happened. And, obviously apartheid ended, but it ended with relatively little violence. And, Mandela handed over power at the end of his first term peacefully. And, South Africa has all sorts of problems now, but it's a pretty amazing story that football played actually quite a significant role in.
Yeah, massively so. And again, like when we come back to the idea of like community clubs and things like that, I remember there was one club in like Wales who they brought out a third kit that had like a design of like fish and chips or something on it, like just completely bizarre, but it made them quite a lot of money.
Yeah, there's one that was sausages was another one. Yeah, I mean, it just gets your attention, doesn't it? Social media, fair play.
Yeah, exactly. It gets attention, but then if it sells, those guys actually put the money towards like setting up community football initiatives in their community. So again, like it can be used for good. And again, I don't think we should take a lot of this too seriously, but when you start actually digging into the reasons behind football kits and why they come out, especially sponsorships, then, you can unpack quite a lot. And one thing that's always came to mind is when you go to leagues like in Austria, the sheer amount of sponsors that are on the shirts, because they're absolutely everywhere in those kits. Wherever there's a space, they just put one on.
Yeah, South America, there they often have like 5 or 6. Yeah, I don't quite know why that is, to be honest. I mean, I suppose each one becomes worth a bit less. Like, you wouldn't want to be the front of shirt sponsor if there's 4 or 5 other ones.
Yeah, devalues it a bit as well, I suppose. And is there any way that, people I suppose that this is kind of a question in two parts, right? For a start, should people really be going out and trying to identify football kits that have ulterior motives? I don't think that's a necessarily fun way to be engaging with your football. But like, obviously, there are football kits that are being produced with these motives in mind. Obviously, a lot of them can be quite dodgy and iffy, but you are kind of touching on stepping on people's football experience a little bit there by asking them to do that. But is there a way that some football kits can actually be identified? Are some that are more blatant than others in terms of what it is they're actually trying to do? For example, the owner of a club or a state that's involved with producing that particular kit.
Well, I mean, I don't think people really like hearing it. And Newcastle fans don't really like hearing about how they're owned by a very oppressive regime. They want to talk to you about winning the League Cup and about, how good Bruno Guimaraes is. They don't want to talk about all the executions Saudi Arabia carried out last year, or the same when it comes to Etihad, which is not just on Man City shirts, but the name of their stadium that's read out on Sky Sports every week, which is again an undemocratic country in Abu Dhabi. So yeah, I think people prefer not to talk about it, but it's there and it's in your face and it's on your TV every weekend.
True. There's again, like coming back to the start, like you said, there's no real way to escape it. And is there any other examples that you can think of, Joey, just from your book or through your work otherwise that you want to mention just before we finish up for today?
So one fun one was in Colombia when there was a picture of a dead gangster's face on the back.
My God.
And that was a story of a football club owned by one of the drug cartels that came out off the back of the death of Pablo Escobar in the early 90s. And yeah, this football club was owned by a massive organised criminal who was sanctioned by the American government. And I went to watch a game there and I saw on the back of someone's shirt a little silhouette of a dead gangster's face.
So they just had that there in the back of the shirts, like below where the names would be or above where the names would be in those contexts?
Above where the name would be, like sort of on the collar, this sort of silhouette of a man who was a tribute to the dead gangster.
Just to remember him, that's absolutely crazy. And again, like when we talk about narco states and things like that, again, it's a massive expression of power, like being able to do that and get away with it. Do you know what I mean? It's crazy to think about.
Yeah, I mean, and I suppose the biggest story there is that football clubs are often owned by pretty unsavoury people. Football clubs can be used to launder dirty money. They can be used to just build your prestige, right? If you're some random businessman and you're scared about people taking a hit on you, own a football club and maybe it makes life a bit easier because you're a sort of celebrity suddenly. No one quite knows the motivation of Roman Abramovich buying Chelsea, but it turned him from like just another billionaire that no one's heard of, a kind of grey man in a grey suit, to one of the most famous Russians on the planet, which must give you a bit of security and protection, I think, because, you're so famous and all the Chelsea fans around the world love you. So, I think people can own football clubs for all sorts of reasons.
Yeah, 100%. Vladimir Romanov comes to mind as well. Who knows what was going through that guy's head when he was in charge at Hearts. Some absolutely crazy decisions and things going on there. I mean, it's not all money laundering, is it though? Or is it? Because, a lot of people kind of have this perception that a lot of it, especially at certain levels of the game, is just for putting dirty money through. Is it the case that a lot of people are just buying football clubs to launder?
Well, I think maybe at the lower levels in certain other countries. I think, Roman Abramovich lost or spent £2 billion of his own money on Chelsea. Like, he wasn't washing dirty money or anything like that. He was spending enormous amounts of his own money, maybe because he loved it, maybe because to build his own prestige. No one can really answer that question about why, but football is basically a way to lose money, right? Very few people are making any at the ownership level. But I mean, money laundering is a big problem, particularly in some, like less developed countries. Just on a fundamental level, you've got a load of cash. You don't want the bank you want to swap it for new cash that wasn't just taken from a drug dealing or whatever. If you're selling people hot dogs and beers to 50,000 people, you can put a load of cash through the tills, get new cash. Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that something's going on in like the Premier League, but a very cash-heavy business in parts of the world is certainly useful to criminals in that respect.
Yeah, 100%. Again, like it's always, we have quite a lot of these conversations with different people around similar themes, and always try and say after them, like, please don't let this spoil your experience of football. Like when you go to see your club every week, because it's interesting having these conversations, but at the end of the day, we all still go to football because we need a bit of a break. Do you know what I mean? And it's up to you whether or not you want to engage with these different things. I just do it because I find it really interesting. It's important to me, but ultimately, like, if I want to go to a game and I'm like feeling really shit through the week, then that game is a bit of an escape for me.
Yeah, and that's something I'm always, as I said, I'm a huge Villa fan. I go to games a lot there. And like, for me, that's just entirely separate to these kind of moral quandaries or whatever. And I like to keep it separate. And I don't sit there thinking, oh no, is that sponsor dodgy or whatever? Like,
yeah.
It's So I don't personally find that hard to have that separation in my head, and I don't think other people should either. I just think, if you love football, you're interested by it, and you like politics and the news and history, there's so many fascinating stories there.
Yeah, 100%. There's a lot of different angles that you can go down. Probably doesn't help that it's your day job as well to investigate these things. So when you actually do get to attend a match at your club, you probably just want to switch off for a bit. So it's entirely understandable. But Joey, this has been a really fascinating chat. Thank you very much for coming on our show tonight.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. I've enjoyed it.
No, it's been great speaking with you and speaking about your new book. We'll put links to it in the show notes for this episode so all of our listeners can go and pick up a copy. Of course, thank you very much to all of our listeners for tuning in for this episode. If there's any questions that you have about it, or if you want to suggest an episode yourself, you can get in touch with us by DM us an X at _footyheritage or emailing us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk. But that'll do us for tonight. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.